She was born into a fortune so large it could buy entire city blocks. And then she disappeared from the world that created her. For more than half a century, a woman worth over $300 million lived in a way no one could fully explain. She owned mansions she never slept in, rooms filled with priceless art she rarely touched, and a name powerful enough to open any door in America, yet she chose to close every single one herself. Her name was Hugette Clark. No scandals splashed across tabloids, no dramatic downfall, no public meltdown. That's what makes this story disturbing. While the world obsessed over celebrity excess, she quietly erased herself. She stopped attending parties. She stopped appearing in public. Eventually, she stopped living in her own homes. Instead, she moved into a hospital and stayed there for decades. Doctors said she didn't need to be there. Nurses said she was polite, distant, and impossibly private. Lawyers circled. Accountants waited. Strangers wrote letters asking for money, friendship, or simply proof that she still existed. She answered almost no one. Imagine this for a moment. You inherit a fortune larger than most people can comprehend. You could travel anywhere, love anyone, become anything, and yet you choose a life where no one is allowed inside. Not physically, not emotionally, not even historically. There were rumors, of course, that she was afraid of the outside world, that she was manipulated by people she trusted, that she was hiding something too painful to face. But the most unsettling question was always the same. What makes a woman with everything choose nothing? Because this isn't a story about shyness or eccentric wealth. This is a story about control, fear, and a decision so extreme that it turned money into a prison instead of freedom. A story where silence lasted longer than most lives. A story where the real mystery isn't how she lived, but why she refused to be seen at all. And once you understand what she gave up, you may never look at inheritance the same way again. Introduce, setting, and subject. To understand how a woman could vanish in plain sight, you first have to understand the world she was born into. She didn't grow up rich in the modern sense. This wasn't celebrity money earned and lost in a single generation. This was old, immovable wealth, industrial wealth. The kind of money that doesn't chase attention because attention eventually comes to it anyway. Her father, William Andrews Clark, was one of the richest men in America at the turn of the 20th century, a copper baron, a U.S. senator, a man whose name was etched into buildings, institutions, and power structures that still exist today. He didn't just make money, he shaped the environment around him. When he built something, it stayed. By the time she was born, the fortune was already mythological, hundreds of millions of dollars in early 20th century terms, mansions in New York and California, a private art collection that rivaled museums, influence that moved quietly through boardrooms and politics without needing introductions. She was born late in her father's life, fragile and closely guarded. From the beginning, she was not raised to be seen. She was raised to be protected. This matters more than it sounds. Her childhood was defined by isolation long before she chose it herself. Tutors instead of classrooms, controlled environments instead of playgrounds, a life where privacy wasn't a preference but a rule. Her father believed the world was dangerous, predatory, unworthy of his daughter, and he had the money to enforce that belief. When he died, he didn't just leave her a fortune, he left her a blueprint for how to live with it. And that blueprint was built on distance. In the early years, she did what was expected. She appeared occasionally. She lived quietly, but not invisibly. She was known in certain circles as gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply reserved. She loved dolls, miniatures, and music. She collected objects not for display, but for personal meaning. There was nothing scandalous about her behavior. If anything, people found her oddly old-fashioned, even by the standards of the time. But something was already forming beneath the surface. Because money like this does something subtle to a person. It removes urgency, it removes consequences, and eventually, it removes witnesses. She never had to explain herself, never had to justify absence, never had to perform normalcy for survival. If she didn't want to attend an event, the event simply happened without her. If she didn't want to answer questions, no one could force her to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her world began to shrink. Friends became acquaintances. Acquaintances became letters. Letters went unanswered. Her homes, once full of staff and movement, became sealed environments where time barely registered. Entire floors untouched for decades. Rooms preserved like frozen moments, as if waiting for someone who never returned. What made this stranger was that she wasn't hiding from scandal. There was no great disgrace driving her inward, no ruined reputation, no public humiliation. She wasn't running away from the world because it rejected her. She rejected it first. And then came the decision that truly confused everyone. She moved into a hospital, not for weeks, not for recovery. She moved in as if it were a residence, year after year, decade after decade, while her mansions sat empty, while her wealth continued to grow, while lawyers, distant relatives, and institutions watched in disbelief. Doctors said she could leave. She refused. Staff noticed she wasn't delusional. She was coherent, articulate, polite. She paid her bills. She followed routines. She simply chose not to go anywhere else. That choice unsettled people more than madness ever could. Because madness explains itself. Choice does not. As time passed, the questions grew darker. Who had access to her? Who spoke for her? Who benefited from her silence? A small circle of professionals slowly took control of her affairs. Some would later insist they were protecting her wishes. Others would argue those wishes were shaped, nudged, even quietly exploited. And hovering over all of it was a haunting possibility. What if this wasn't safety? What if this was retreat so complete that it erased not just her presence, but her voice? She lived long enough to see the modern world emerge without ever participating in it. Television, jet travel, cultural revolutions. Entire generations rose and fell while she remained in the same place, surrounded by white walls, untouched art, and unanswered questions. By the time the public rediscovered her story, she was already a legend without a face. The richest woman no one could reach. The heiress who refused to live like one. The ghost sitting on a fortune she never spent. And the deeper people looked, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, fear, and a childhood that taught her the outside world was something to be survived, not entered. And soon, those quiet choices would collide with reality in a way no amount of wealth could contain. Rise and fall narrative. The early years of her adulthood looked deceptively stable from the outside. Quiet, yes. Withdrawn, certainly. But still anchored to a recognizable life. She lived among her possessions, managed her affairs through trusted intermediaries, and maintained just enough contact with the world to reassure those watching from a distance that everything was fine. But stability was an illusion, built on habit, not connection. Her father, William Andrews Clark, had spent his life controlling environments, mines, railroads, politics, architecture. When he turned that instinct toward parenthood, it shaped her entire emotional geography. Love came wrapped in protection. Safety came with isolation. Independence was never taught because it was never required. So when he died, what she inherited was not only money, but a void. And unlike most people, she didn't rush to fill it. At first, the retreat was subtle. Fewer public appearances, longer stretches of silence, entire seasons passing without her leaving home. People assumed this was grief or temperament. The wealthy are allowed eccentricity, especially when it's quiet. But then came the first real fracture. She stopped living in her own spaces. It wasn't announced. There was no explanation. One day she simply stayed longer at a hospital than expected, then longer still. Days became weeks. Weeks turned into years. Eventually, it became clear that this was no temporary arrangement. Her homes remained fully staffed, meticulously maintained, and completely unused. Beds never slept in. Dining rooms untouched. Artworks sitting in darkness, their value climbing, while their owner chose fluorescent lighting and hospital routines instead. This is where the story shifts from unusual to unsettling, because there was no medical reason compelling her to stay. Doctors evaluated her repeatedly. She was physically capable of leaving, mentally coherent. She understood her finances, recognized people, held conversations with clarity and intelligence. She paid her bills promptly. She made decisions deliberately, which meant this wasn't confinement. It was choice. And that choice triggered a chain reaction. The longer she stayed, the smaller her world became. The fewer people she saw, the easier it was for a handful of voices to become the only voices that mattered. Lawyers, accountants, advisors, people whose livelihoods depended on access. People who insisted they were protecting her privacy while simultaneously managing hundreds of millions of dollars on her behalf. No one forced her to sign anything against her will. That was the defense. But no one encouraged her to re-enter life either. And somewhere in that silence, power quietly shifted. The outside world began to speculate. Some saw her as tragic, others as manipulative. There were whispers that she was being controlled. Counter whispers that she controlled everyone by refusing to participate. The truth was likely far more uncomfortable. She had learned that disappearing was the safest form of agency she knew. The hospital offered structure without demand, routine without exposure, human presence without intimacy. It was a place where she could exist without being seen, where no one expected her to perform a role, host a guest, or justify her solitude. But every retreat has a cost. As the years passed, her fortune continued to grow untouched. She spent almost nothing of significance. Entire collections remained unseen, undocumented, locked away. Institutions that could have benefited from her patronage waited. Distant relatives grew restless. Legal questions multiplied. And with each unanswered question, the tension increased. Because money without visibility invites suspicion. Was she being exploited? Was she being protected? Was she complicit in her own disappearance? Or was this the final expression of a life trained to believe that the world outside was always more dangerous than the one inside? There was no dramatic collapse, no scandalous headline, no single moment where everything fell apart. Instead, there was a slow erosion. A life narrowing so gradually that by the time anyone realized how extreme it had become, it was already irreversible. She had risen into wealth without ever stepping fully into life, and now, without ever falling publicly, she was vanishing completely. And soon, the silence surrounding her would break in ways no one could control. Dark truth revealed. Emotional peak. When the truth finally began to surface, it didn't arrive as a confession. It arrived as paperwork, court documents, medical evaluations, testimonies from people who had spent years orbiting her life without ever truly entering it. What emerged wasn't a single villain or a clean betrayal, but something far more disturbing. A system built on silence, enabled by choice, and protected by wealth. For years, she had been described as fragile, delicate, easily overwhelmed. That narrative became convenient. It justified why she stayed hidden, why decisions were made for her, why the same small group of professionals spoke on her behalf again and again. But when independent doctors finally examined her, their conclusions shattered the myth. She was mentally competent. She understood numbers. She understood contracts. She understood consequences. She knew where she was and why she was there. She knew the size of her fortune. She knew who managed it. And that revelation changed everything. Because if she was competent, then no one was holding her prisoner, which meant the prison was internal. Behind closed doors, staff described a woman who was polite but unreachable. She followed routines meticulously, meals at the same time, conversations kept brief, emotional distance maintained with surgical precision. She rarely spoke about her past, never about her fears, almost never about leaving. When asked why she stayed, her answers were vague. She felt safe. She felt comfortable. She didn't want disruption. Comfort became the shield that protected a far darker truth. Her isolation had become self-sustaining. The fewer people she allowed in, the harder it became to let anyone else close. Each year reinforced the next. The hospital was no longer a place she stayed. It was the boundary she used to keep the world out. Meanwhile, her estate became a battlefield waiting for a war that hadn't started yet. Millions were spent annually on staff, security, and management of properties she never visited. Entire mansions sat sealed, untouched for decades, as if preserved for a return that never came. Artworks of enormous cultural value remained locked away, unseen by scholars or the public. Those around her insisted they were honoring her wishes. But the question no one could answer was this: were those wishes freely formed, Or were they the final outcome of a lifetime conditioned to believe that disappearance was survival? Media attention exploded once her story became public. Headlines painted her as a mystery, a cautionary tale, a symbol of extreme wealth turned inward. Some journalists framed her as tragic, others as manipulative. Many couldn't decide whether to pity her or resent her. What no one could deny was this: she had erased herself more completely than any scandal ever could. There were moments that pierced the emotional armor, small details that felt unbearable in their quietness. She sent gifts to people she hadn't seen in years, accompanied by brief notes written in careful handwriting. She maintained interest in dolls and miniatures, worlds small enough to control, frozen in perfect order. In those details, something devastating became clear. She hadn't chosen emptiness. She had chosen safety at the cost of connection. And the longer it lasted, the harder it became to imagine another way of living. When authorities finally intervened to examine her circumstances, it was too late to undo the pattern. Even with full autonomy confirmed, nothing changed. She stayed. The hospital remained her home. The world remained outside. Because by then, leaving would have required something more terrifying than isolation. It would have required beginning, and beginnings were something she had never been taught how to survive. Channel's opinion, legends, and secret style. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because of what others did to her, but because of what her life forces us to confront about freedom, choice, and responsibility. It's easy to look for villains here, to point at lawyers, advisors, doctors, and systems that quietly benefited from her disappearance. And yes, there were failures, ethical gray zones, people who should have asked harder questions and didn't, people who grew used to managing a fortune without ever truly engaging with the person behind it. But reducing this story to exploitation alone would be a mistake, because the most unsettling truth is that she was not powerless. She was competent, she was informed, she had options most people could never dream of, and yet she consistently chose the smallest possible life. That forces an uncomfortable question. What if extreme wealth doesn't free you, but removes the need to confront fear? Most people are pushed into the world by necessity. Workforces, interaction, survival demands, engagement, even trauma often gets interrupted by the need to function. But she had no such pressure. Her fortune insulated her not only from danger, but from growth. And in that insulation, fear was allowed to settle in and become permanent. There's also something deeply revealing about the way her story fascinates us. We don't just want to know what happened to her. We want reassurance that we wouldn't make the same choice, that if we had her money, we'd live louder, fuller, braver lives. But would we? Or would we, given unlimited safety, slowly retreat from anything that might hurt us? Her life challenges the romantic idea of inheritance. It exposes the lie that money automatically equals freedom. In her case, money removed friction so completely that nothing ever forced her to re-enter life once she stepped away from it. She wasn't destroyed by scandal. She wasn't ruined by addiction. She wasn't silenced by abuse. She simply stopped participating. And that may be the most frightening outcome of all. So here's the question I want to leave with you. Do you see her as tragic or as autonomous? Was she a woman quietly trapped by a system that benefited from her absence? Or was she someone who exercised the only form of control she understood, even if it looked like disappearance from the outside? And what does it say about us that we're more disturbed by a woman choosing nothing than by countless stories of people forced into ruin? Because her life suggests something we rarely want to admit. Sometimes, the most dangerous prison is the one that never locks the door. Open ending, nostalgia. She died quietly, the way she had lived for decades. No final interview, no dramatic revelation, no sudden return to the world she had abandoned. When the news reached the public, it felt less like a death and more like confirmation of something that had already happened long ago. By the time she was gone, her fortune had outlived her presence. Mansions were open for the first time in years. Doors unlocked, dust-covered rooms revealed untouched furniture, sealed letters, and objects waiting patiently for an owner who never came back. Artworks emerged from darkness into light, finally seen by people who had only known them as numbers on a balance sheet. And yet, none of it explained her. Because legacy isn't measured only by what is left behind, but by what was never lived. Her story doesn't offer easy lessons. It doesn't fit into the familiar arc of rise, scandal, and redemption. There is no villain to defeat, no clear injustice to correct, just a woman who chose safety so completely that the world slowly stopped knocking. Some will say she wasted her life. Others will argue she lived exactly as she wished. The truth may be something more unsettling than either. Perhaps she lived the life she was trained for, a life where isolation was love, where control meant survival, where being unseen felt safer than being known. Her wealth will be remembered, her art will be studied, her name will appear in museums, archives, and footnotes of American history. But the person herself remains unreachable, even now. And maybe that was always the point. Some stories aren't built to inspire, they exist to unsettle, to force us to question the assumptions we make about success, freedom, and choice, to remind us that money can build walls just as easily as it opens doors. She was born into $300 million, and she chose a life no one could enter. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,